Delighted to have Dr. Toton here to give the very first talk for her book. As Sue says, we, in organizing, start on time and end on time, so I'm going to keep my remarks short and get it to the heart of the matter here. I have a few bios to read and then some logistics, and then I'll hand it over. So, for those of you that don't know, Suzanne Toton holds an EDD in religion and education from the Columbia University Teachers College, and an MA and a BA from Temple University. Dr. Toton retired from Villanova University in 2016 and is a former associate professor of Christian ethics in the Theology and Religious Studies Department of Villanova University. She spearheaded and coordinated the university's institutional partnerships with Catholic Relief Services for more than 12 years. At Villanova, she contributed to developing community-based learning and taught community-based learning courses regularly. And she was the 2016 recipient of the university's Faculty Service Award. Dr. Toton's first book, World Hunger, The Responsibility of Christian Education, published by Orbis Books, won the 1982, if you can believe it, Best Book Award of the College Theology Society. Her second book, Justice Education, From Service to Solidarity, was published by Marquette University Press in 2008. Her articles have appeared in prominent journals, and Dr. Toton was selected as one of 30 leaders nationwide recognized by Bread for the World for her dedication to engaging students in addressing world hunger. If I may add a brief personal note, and I know Sue doesn't want me editing her work at all, but I'm just going to interject. Sue has made an incredible impression on so many people at Villanova and beyond. I was just talking with a professor here who had gone on the first Rwanda trip, and he said, in so many words, Sue changed my life. She has been doing that before I met her husband, Jerry, and I know that he has stolen basically all of his good ideas from Sue on Catholic Relief Services and advocacy work and education at Cabrini. Changed my life. So, secondhand, Sue, thank you for all of the things that you've done to affect the world. Our respondent today is Christine Tucker. Christine spent 35 years at Catholic Relief Services, serving at headquarters and overseas. She served as Chief of Staff to Ken Hackett, former CRS President and Chief Operating Officer, and was Regional Director for the Middle East North Africa region. She was Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean region. She's contributed articles to the Journal of Catholic Social Thought and the Catholic Theology Society's volume, Handing on the Faith. Since retiring, Chris has been affiliated with the Ignatian Volunteer Corps, first as a volunteer working with asylum seekers and survivors of human trafficking. Additionally, in collaboration with the Innovation Works in Baltimore, Chris has been developing formation materials, weaving mission, identity, and values into support for the creation of social enterprises in marginalized communities. Through Loyola University, Chris has been trained to lead the Ignatian spiritual exercises, leading participants through these exercises, as well as providing spiritual direction for the last 4 years. Before we welcome our panel, just a quick note, we do have food in the back that'll be available well after this is done. After we're nourished by word, we can have some food. We're also going to have time for questions at the end. Please, as you're listening, keep in mind, what are the things that are striking you? What do you want to know more about? What resonates, especially given our current state of affairs today in the world? And what would you like to carry forward from what you're hearing here? And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Sue Toton.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'd especially like to thank Ray for all the work he did in pulling this together, and the Center for Peace and Justice Education for the work that they've put in this, as well as the co-sponsors and the Falvey Library staff. And I'd like to thank all of you for turning out. It's amazing to see you all here, and I'm so grateful that you did. I'm very honored to be part of campus events commemorating the faithful witness of Archbishop Oscar Romero. My prayer is that my book might contribute to amplify his cry for justice and peace in our day that's so desperately needed. I want to start with this. This is a gizmo I bought. It's a wire cutter. very, very good. It's a timer. So I'm going to use it to make sure that I stay on time, and Ray's going to stand up and say, move away. You exceeded your time. Okay. My first encounter with Catholic Relief Services was in 2002 at a national conference for Catholic universities and colleges. Eileen Emerson, Catholic Relief Services Peace and Justice Peace and Justice Coordinator briefed a group of Justice and Peace faculty and campus ministers about CRS's work. She made a fatal mistake of offering to provide speakers, CRS speakers, and material for our courses and programming related to global poverty and peace. For me, this was a dream come true. I was always trying to make material in my courses come alive for my students, especially in my global poverty classes. Well, many CRS guest lectures later, CRS approached Villanova and 4 other Catholic colleges and universities in the United States to enter into an institutional partnership with it. And in May 2005, executives of CRS and Villanova signed a memorandum of understanding, but I'll have more on that later. Just to clarify, Catholic Relief Services is the official international relief and development agency of the U.S. Catholic Church. It was created in 1943 by the U.S. bishops to assist refugees from war-torn Europe. And over the past 80-plus years, CRS has served the world's most vulnerable populations in more than 100 countries overseas, easing suffering and providing assistance to people in need without regard to race, religion, or nationality. In its 80-year history, CRS has faced multiple crises. The story in this book tells of one such crisis, the Rwanda genocide. The story is a story of profound institutional and personal transformation. My interest in this story began with an incredibly moving speech by Catholic Relief Services Executive Vice President Michael Wiest at Fordham University. CRS had been working in Rwanda for more than 30 years, whose programming was considered model programming. But in April 1994, in a matter of 100 days, approximately 1 million Tutsis and moderate Hutus were brutally murdered. The genocide, we said, had brought the agency to its knees. CRS lost 5 of its staff and countless relatives, friends, and associates. Its offices were looted, and its programming throughout the country was destroyed. We said CRS's staff were aware of the tensions between the Tutsis and Hutus, but they had learned to ignore them and work around them, telling themselves that resolving tensions was not part of the agency's mandate. But we asked, how do we not see what was in front of us all along? What did we refuse to see? Why didn't we act? And as a Catholic agency, how did we not see this problem of hatred and distrust as being part of our mission? I was struck by the fact that Wiest was bringing both himself into question and the agency into question. But he ended his speech on a hopeful note. He said it was the study of Catholic social teaching and the agency's decision to adopt justice as its operating ethos or lens that provided the courage, the strength, the vision, and direction to move forward. I have to admit I was skeptical of this, so I decided to meet with Wiest. And I expressed my skepticism to him, and at that point he practically leapt over the desk. I thought he was going to strangle me. And he said, look, you don't need to be speaking to me. You need to be speaking to Krista. She knows this process that we went through like the back of her hand. The process. About a year and a half after the genocide, Ken Hackett, who was the president and CEO of CRS, launched a year-long planning process to thoroughly evaluate the agency's mission, its identity, and its work, and to chart its future direction. He pulled together 60 of its most experienced staff, one of whom was Chris, and divided them into 3 planning teams. And he tasked them with analyzing the global operating environment, identifying the principal challenges to the agencies working in this environment, and recommending how the agency can meet these challenges. I was drawn to one of the teams in particular, largely because of their critical analysis and their persistent questioning. This is their situational analysis. Their situational analysis in brief said that despite the data from the US Agency for International Development, the United Nations Development Program, the World Bank, and others, suggesting that genuine progress was being made, they did not see people moving up and out of poverty. The team was struck by a more noticeable trend, the widening gap between rich and poor within countries and between the rich and poor countries themselves, and the injustices that resulted. The built-in political, economic, and social structures seemed designed to keep people in their place, keep them where they were. It wasn't a matter, they reasoned that it wasn't a matter of needing more resources transferred. Whereas Chris Tucker, I think, put it, it's not a matter of more toilets and sinks. Was that you?
Maybe.
So it's not a matter of more resource transfers to address the problem. The loss of programs overnight made that clear, that poverty alleviation wasn't good enough. The team persisted in its questioning. They asked, is it enough to do what we're already doing? Or do it better? Or add some new programming areas? What is at the root of hunger, poverty, discrimination, inequity, powerlessness, gender, and class inequality? We have to get to the bottom of it. Is what we keep coming up with big enough? Is it bold enough to address the changes, the radical changes that are needed? They kept going back to the drawing board over and over and over again. They had the sense that this was an opportunity like no other to make a difference in the agency and the lives of the people they served. One of the staff I interviewed said, it was Chris Tucker who said, look, it's not we who are going to suffer the consequences of our decisions. It will be the people that we serve. For them, it's a matter of their lives and death. The breakthrough came when they said to themselves, if it's not a matter of resource transfers, perhaps we need to look elsewhere. And they said, why don't we look at our identity? How are we different from other agencies, from CARE, from SAVE, from the International Rescue Committee? Well, the answer is obvious. We're a Catholic agency. But then they asked, well, what difference does that make? Is there anything in church teaching that's pertinent to our work and that could provide guidance? This led them to Catholic social teaching and to examine it closely. What they saw was that it wasn't simply a set of documents, but a vision of the world that places the dignity of the human person at the forefront of all human activity and celebrates the interconnectedness of all people. Catholic social teaching is a call to conscience, and it was a call to action. It offered a set of principles and values for actions. It spoke to the dignity and equality of all human persons, to justice, to rights and responsibility, to the social nature of human beings, to the common good, to solidarity and stewardship, and the preferential option of the poor. And as they looked more closely at Catholic social teaching on justice, they thought, maybe this might provide direction. They concluded after a lot of deliberation that genuine development and peace can be built only on just relationships and on just economic, political, and social structures and systems. So the team made a recommendation to the executive committee, and it read, CRS's principal operating ethic has been charity and the alleviation of suffering. But as we look to the next century, in order to serve the world's poor and disadvantaged most effectively in the evolving world context, the agency's principal operating ethic should be the promotion of justice. They insisted that justice would not be a new program, but it needed to be implemented in and through existing programs. The operating lens through which they would view and analyze situations in which they worked and developed programs was justice. Justice would be their lens. And they also used the term, every time they spoke of justice, they then linked it to right relationships. Because they wanted to give a quick definition of what justice is in Catholic social teaching. So it was justice and right relationships. It was presented to the leadership, and then it was discussed many meetings. And finally, the leadership of Catholic Relief presented this to its board of directors. So this was CRS's leadership statement to the board of directors. The relief and amelioration of human suffering, the development and empowerment of peoples, and the advocacy of human rights remain primary in our mission of charity. We realize that we must work towards a fuller sense of our mission by making the promotion of social and economic justice central in our actions. We see CRS as part of our transformation taking place. As part of our transformation taking place among individuals, institutions, and structures, we see justice as part of our transformation, so as to assure that all people have a fuller existence and dignity. Okay, now, I didn't leave a page out. Now, what I want to do is I want to show you how they implemented justice in an emergency situation. By the way, I should tell you, when they presented this to the leadership of CRS, and it presented it to the board of directors, one of the bishops responded to Ken Hackett, "What took you so long?" I mean, we're talking about a year-long process. So in the book, I have a number of case studies, and I want to just focus on one case study because part of the concern was that justice could not be implemented in an emergency situation, that people would be leaving with just as shirts on their backs. It was impossible to apply it to an emergency situation. So I want to share how CRS went about doing this. It's a story of Hurricane Mitch. In October 1998, one of the most powerful and deadliest hurricanes hit the Caribbean and Central America, bringing historic rainfall to Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Honduras bore the brunt of the destruction. CRS had a well-developed three-pronged emergency response strategy that it had used time and time again. We need to save lives by meeting immediate needs. We need to sustain livelihoods by reconstructing the reproductive sectors, and we need to rebuild civil society. But what was going to be new was this effort for the very first time to apply justice, the option for justice, to an emergency response. So Doug Ryan, Catholic Relief Services country representative for Honduras, vividly remembered a 6-hour meeting in Honduras a short while after the hurricane hit. It was a meeting with staff and with church partners. The purpose was to build a framework informed by Catholic social teaching and the justice lens. Ryan said this helped us to pause. He said so many times in these emergencies, I feel like an entertainer at Vegas running around, spinning plates on a stick and running from one to the other, to the other, to the other. But he said this meeting forced us to pause and to take stock of what we were going to do, what was going to guide what we were going to do. So the key points of the framework were, and this is really important, that CRS would not rebuild the poverty or return people to the status quo that existed before the hurricane. Justice or right relationships would be at the core of its strategy, and its strategy would be guided by the principles of Catholic social teaching. It was essential, they felt from the get-go, to identify the relationships that needed to be rethought, from the local level to the municipal, to the national, to the international, between the church in Central America and the US church, governments, US government, institutions like the World Bank. So let's identify the significant relationships, and let's rethink what our relationship to those relationships will be, because they're important in the rebuilding. So in keeping with the principle of subsidiarity, the group determined that Central Americans, first and foremost, hold responsibility for rebuilding Central America. CRS would not lead the relief and recovery effort or allow itself to be perceived as leading that effort. Its role would be being in solidarity with the local church and local organizations so that the ownership of this process remained with them. As Doug Ryan said, there wasn't going to be any white horse development here. He said, the image that we sometimes have of ourselves is that we ride in on this white horse and we write out the checks and we make it all go away. He said, if there were going to be heroes to emerge out of this disaster, it would not be CRS. The survivors, not CRS, were the ones who would pick themselves up, dust themselves off, deal with their loss and grief, and rebuild their lives. They would be in charge, and they would make decisions. In keeping with Catholic social teaching's principle of subsidiarity, they agree that no higher level of government or organization should perform any function or duty that can be handled more effectively at the lower level by people who are closer to the problem and have a better understanding of the issues. Local responses should be developed by community groups and institutions themselves in conjunction with local officials. It was essential for communities to be involved both in the physical reconstruction and also in the decisions that were being made. In keeping with Catholic social teaching's principles of the common good and the preferential option for the poor, they agreed that it was important for the survivors to recognize their right to restore their own lives and the lives of the people in their communities. They have responsibility for the common good. So decision-making structures need to be put in place, organized by communities. But as Ryan said, these committees, these decision-making structures would not be made up of men sitting around a circle, making decisions about how to use resources or hide them. They had to be broad-based. They had to be elected. They had to include women, evangelicals, youth, etc. These committees would reflect and represent the local communities' priorities and decisions in the reconstruction process. Preferential option for the poor. Ryan said it was important for decisions that needed to be made about who in the community was most vulnerable, most affected, and what development activities were most critical. He said, one of the things the communities decided was the first thing to be rebuilt were the schools. They said nothing restores a sense of normalcy more than to have the school bell ring, kids' lunch packed, taking them off to school. In sum, Ryan said that the ultimate goal was building a society in solidarity with itself. So CRS and its partners provided skills development to promote community building, participation in decision making, organizing, conflict resolution, to conduct social audits, monitor spending, organize and enable communities to be in and stay in relationship with these officials, provide tools and training for community needs surveys and mapping, local development planning, project development. In addition to what was going on the local level, major policy decisions were also being made in Washington and on the international level that would affect the reconstruction that was going on the local level. For example, the crushing debt, migration, human rights, monitoring the amount of emergency assistance, holding officials accountable for where their money goes. If these opportunities were not seized and decisions made by communities themselves, all the solid work that had begun could very well be undermined. So advocacy was essential. So CRS and its partners contributed to organizing mass civil society networks and coalitions on the national, regional, and international levels. In sum, saving lives and sustaining livelihoods would continue to be pillars of CRS's approach, but the justice lens now offered a new way to move forward. Now, I'm just going to end it with a brief note on the partnership with Catholic Relief Services. As I mentioned, in May 2005, the executives of CRS in Villanova signed a memorandum of understanding. And the purpose of it was to foster collaboration with CRS across the colleges and schools in the university, its institutes, its centers, administration, faculty, student organizations, to address some of the significant issues of justice and peace. The issues included, for example, peace in Sudan. It was really Dan Griffin who launched this campaign at headquarters. The Syrian refugee crisis, the Iraqi refugee crisis, global water crisis, gender-based violence, migration, unaccompanied minors, and others. I describe in my book some of the incredibly creative programming that took place on Villanova's campus. And while a good number of these issues were generated by CRS, we also generated issues that we felt were important to do education, consciousness-raising advocacy on. And the action that took place on each of the campuses that were partners were very different from one another. We designed those actions. So it took the form of visuals or major conferences, courses, workshops, overseas experiences, research. Personally, coordinating the Villanova University partnership was one of the most significant experiences of my 40 years at Villanova. In my judgment, Catholic Relief Services represents the very best of the Catholic Church. And I'm forever grateful for the opportunity it has given me to be part of a larger community of faith. I retired in 2016 to make more headway in writing this book. And Dan Griffin was made full-time director of the partnership. I hope what I've talked to you about is of interest, and if you want to explore it further, you have an incredible resource here in the person of Dan Griffin. He's the director of the partnership, and he has a wealth of experience and knowledge, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to share that with you. So thank you very much, and I'm going to turn to Chris. You didn't have to.
I had to chuckle when Sue said she was very conscious about keeping time with hers. My philosophy was always, hey, I got the mic. Thank you for being here. Let me just echo that. I know that Sue and Ray have already said that, but it means a lot to us to know that there's interest, and Sue has done an incredible job of describing the contents of her book. There's a lot more there, and so I would encourage you to buy it and read it. So Sue asked me to talk a little bit about the lessons learned from the case study and the process that took place, and also relevance to today's challenges. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit from talking about the things that are specifically the experiences in the book to talk about that. So there's really 5 lessons that I would highlight, and from what Sue has talked about, the first one will come as no surprise to you, and that is Catholic social teaching matters. Start with faith, not ideology. Catholic social teaching is about stepping outside of the divisions that we are living in. No matter how you might see those divisions, it's about asking the questions, what is the world that we want to see? And Catholic social teaching provides principles and tenets for us to think about that, so that what we can see is more inclusive for everyone, that transcends matters of religious affiliation to something that is inclusive for all of mankind. So it is eminently practical. Catholic social teaching matters. The second lesson learned is when we talk about relationships, when we talk about justice, this initially was an issue for us because people didn't understand what justice was. Some people thought that it was about a legal system, it was about judging the actions of others. There were all kinds of different interpretations. And it wasn't until we really settled on justice is right relationships that we were able to shift that conversation into something that would be in line with Catholic social teaching. So the second lesson then is about right relationships, justice, but that they are rooted in a specific context and linked with everyday experience. Justice is not out there someplace. Justice is not something that we learn about. Justice is something that we live. So when we talk about justice and Catholic social teaching, it's not limited to questions like, do we go to Mass on Sunday, or church, or synagogue, or temple? And it's also not about programs, which are the programs that we run. But it's about building relationships and having encounters with others in our daily lives. Concrete actions and attitudes on a daily basis. So it's about all of us, all of our individual contacts, all of our individual lives. The next lesson is start with reflection and make it personal. So we're here at a university, and there's a lot of great teaching that's taking place. There's a lot of research that's being done. But all of that theology and research and studying is not going to matter unless it begins with a sense of identity, a formation in values, and a personal grappling with key questions such as, what do I believe? What does all of this stuff that I'm learning mean for me? And from that, what does it mean for us? And what does it mean for those people that we care about, those people we serve? So start with reflection and make it personal. The fourth lesson is you have to allow the Spirit to move. We found that as we were looking at the justice lens, people were hungry for dialogue and for making the world a better place. We didn't need to instill that in people. So our approach was not and could not be limited to a particular approach or one particular set of actions. So if you say, what was the plan? Well, there really was no master plan, but there were a series of smaller plans which evolved over time, each one going deeper into relationships. So that framework had to be big enough so that everybody, whether you were sitting in headquarters, in any country around the world, if you had any particular job in any of those offices or with our partners, that you had the ability for creative responses. And it was that very freedom from that making it personal that resulted in the stories that are in the book. And that literally expanded across the world and did tremendous work here at Villanova as well. And the fifth lesson was called to greater boldness. So we're not just talking about change. In those individual relationships that we've been talking about, as they grow, they form a web. And as that web grows, so do possibilities for change. But that change in itself is not sufficient. The call is to greater boldness for that vision which comes out of identity and values. So that radical new vision is what is going to change the world. And that is what we are called to be part of. So when you think about the major transformation, not change, but transformation, you will see a call to greater boldness. And that call is for each of us. So those were the lessons that we learned. And you can say, okay, that's great. But how are they relevant to today's challenges? The book is about institutional and individual transformation. It changed programs. It changed lives. It changed our partnerships. It changed our relationships. So if in her book, Sue did nothing else but document some of those stories, it would have been wonderful because there are some really good stories in there. There are some very powerful stories of courage. Each of the stories took place during times of major crises: genocide, natural disaster, humanitarian crossroads, corruption, poverty, loss of resources, you name it. And it would be easy to say, she talked about Rwanda, but that was a long time ago. Nobody talks about Rwanda anymore. You could even say justice. Who talks about justice except the Center for Justice and Peace Studies? People, normal people, you don't read about that in the newspapers. So how is that relevant to what we do? You could ask questions like that about all of the stories that are in there. But what I would say to that is that the events that were described in the book, as they unfolded, the decisions that were made were critical to life and death. The context was people being uprooted from their homes, forced to leave, or stay living in fear, living in poverty, communities being torn apart, and institutions and people struggling for answers about what the heck to do about this. It's absolutely true that the names and places have changed from the book to today. But I would ask you, are these not the same challenges we face today? Particularly when we're talking about relationships. As we look at our communities, as we look at our nation, as we look internationally, are those not the same issues? And are those not relationships that are being stretched extremely thin or being broken? So I would say these lessons are just as important, and in some ways even more important because of the context that we are living in. So if that is the same, then we also have the same opportunity to take a pause and say, what does Catholic social teaching tell us about this? What do we do in a way that really makes sense based on who we are and what our values are? And if we have the opportunity, then we also have the responsibility to do so in ways that are consistent with who we are and who we believe. Now, if you get the book and you think you're going to find a blueprint, let me give you a spoiler alert. You will not. What it does do, though, is offer hope that in moments of crisis, transformation can be done in significant ways that can really make a difference. So what are some of the questions that we might ask ourselves? Well, certainly one of them is, does Catholic social teaching shape our thinking about these challenges? Does it? Do we want it to? Another question could be, in the midst of all of this, how are we called to be beacons of hope, whether at the personal level or institutional level? In terms of making it personal, what is life asking of me at this moment in time? What are we asking of each other? And institutionally, how can we create greater space for people to pause and ask these questions with each other so that the responses that we do have can also be carried out? So it's that sense of we need to pause and create that space. And that is extremely important for institutions, particularly for those here, such as at Villanova. So as we consider questions like this, I'd just like to add a few additional notes on our experience. The first, as I've mentioned a couple of times, is the importance of Catholic social teaching. We see this every day as we listen to the news, if we read the paper, the podcast, however you get your news about what's going on. What is going on in the country and the world is crying out for a consideration of this in light of these teachings. And more recently, under the leadership of Pope Leo, we repeatedly hear the call for us to be a church for the poor, the marginalized, and the vulnerable. He calls us again to be the Good Samaritan. So here's the thing about that. Usually when we think about the Good Samaritan, we think, yeah, this is all about the person who helps. And the person who helps does an amazing act of charity. But that parable is also about the victim lying by the side of the road. And the recognition that every single one of us, even though we want to be the Samaritan, very often we are also that victim by the side of the road. And so it is in essence not about solving somebody else's problem, but it is about healing one another in ways that we can build greater, stronger communities. The relationships that were built in that parable were very important. It's important to look at both sides of that. The next additional note I would like to say is that, as Sue notes in her book, the voice for justice, for Catholic social teaching within CRS, it didn't start with the leadership. The leaders were immersed in the crisis. They were trying to figure out how to keep the lights on, how to keep programs going, how to work with trying to get more resources. The initial voice came from staff around the world. As those voices grew, people were able to listen and to realize that this is what made sense. But the reason that I mention this is that every single person here doesn't need to wait for other people to say, here's what the answer is, here's what we need to do. If you're waiting for someone else, you're probably going to wait a long time. That's not what it's about. It's about the freedom to speak and to ask new questions. That freedom to have that space to explore it together. One of the wonderful things that's happened in recent years is more talk about synodality. What does that mean? It means simply talking to each other about things that we care very deeply about and allowing the Spirit to move in that dialogue so we can figure it out. One of the things that St. Romero said is, each one of you has to be God's microphone. Each one of you has to be a messenger, a prophet. So don't wait to be a leader. Be a prophet. And the Spirit will move. Another final note is that I would make is, as we've talked about relationships, I hope we haven't made it sound like it was an easy process, because in many ways, change, particularly change that is transformational, means that there's a lot of soul searching, there's a lot of questions, and there's a lot of grieving that takes place. Fear, what are we going to leave behind? What does this mean for me? What if I invested my whole life in something? Are you saying that is no longer valuable? No, that's not it at all. But we have to honor that fear and grief can be part of it. And part of that dialogue is acknowledging that it can be very difficult. But as Sue said, at the end of the day, it is about those who are the most poor, the most vulnerable, those who will be hurt the most if we don't take these actions. And then finally, I don't need to tell you, the world is changing at breathtaking speed. I never know when I get up what big changes will have taken place while I was sleeping. That's what it felt like at the time that these stories were taking place. And I think if anything, it's accelerated. But what gives me hope is that those of you who are now taking on these new challenges, you've got new tools that we certainly didn't have. And you certainly know how to use those tools better than I do. I can tell you that. Technology, social media, AI, these are certainly the ones that come to my mind. There is an urgency here to use those, to have that dialogue, to engage with this rapidly changing world. But the other thing is, you, particularly here at Villanova, have a tremendous gift in the form of Pope Leo. And I can't wait to see how that gift is going to be shared with others here. So what Sue and I have talked about today, the stories that we've shared with you, we recognize that in many ways, these are just seeds. Seeds that were planted in some of the work that we did in Sue's writing. They have been planted, they've been watered, but our hope really of coming to speak about this is that the faith and the values that were behind them, that I know are shared by people in this room, will continue to grow in each of us individually and us together, so that our responses moving forward will be grounded in that same love which we have already received and to which we are called. So thank you.
Thank you both so much. We do have some time for questions. I'm going to repeat the questions because we don't have a mic for the audience. So I'll listen intently. Just raise your hand, I'll call on you, and then I'll repeat the question just in case our panelists need to hear some more.
Do you have any advice for approaching right relationship with those that treat you unjustly?
Huge question. Can you repeat the question?
Yes, good. So for the rest of the room, the question is, do you have any advice for how to treat someone, how to form right relationship with someone who treats you unjustly? If you'll turn on the mics, that'll be great.
We can both answer that. So when you talk about someone who treats you unjustly, what I'm hearing in that is the recognition that because of that, there could be fear, there could be anger, there could be some kind of negative emotion that comes from that. It certainly is not a pleasant experience, but it comes down to one's identity and values. If I know who I am, then if that person doesn't validate that, I still know who I am. I still know what my values are. And I can recognize that rather than judging the person back, there's probably some healing, some woundedness inside of them. And so at the end of the day, they may want to make it personal, but I don't have to make it personal.
The only thing that I would add, is this on? I think so. Yeah, the only thing that I would add is that, is that I think returning kindness, returning kindness. Because your instinct, at least my instinct, is to fight back, be angry, be annoyed, and attack. But I find that when you're open and you're generous and you're kind, it kind of disarms the person, and it's healing for yourself and for the person. It's unfair or unjust. That's just so talking.
Gregory, did you want to add anything else to that? Or is that okay? Got a question right here.
My question was, so have you had to work with people from other faiths, and like if yes, how has that changed the way you approached things that might be slightly different from Catholic teaching?
Mm-hmm.
So the question was, have you had to work with people from other faiths? If so, how did that change the way you worked? If it brought in things from faiths that weren't Catholic?
Great question. And the reason is because when CRS started looking at the concept of right relationships in Catholic social teaching, the formation that took place was for everybody from Ken Hackett, who was the executive director, down to the tea lady and the driver in Indonesia. So it is something that everybody did. There were a total of 6,000 people of every major faith, of secular, and all kinds of different traditions. What we found is that the principles of Catholic social teaching really were universal. And so by talking about the principles rather than focusing on this is Catholic belief, but rather this is what we believe, it was not an issue. As a matter of fact, one of the Muslim staff that I worked with said to me, you know, I can be a better Muslim because I work for Catholic Relief Services. And they were very grateful because while they agreed with the principles, many of their own traditions hadn't written them out to the same extent that Catholic social teaching had. So there was a body of information there, and people could talk about what the value was, the value within the teaching, and there was universal acceptance from that.
Sue, anything you want to? Do you want to add anything to that?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maureen, please.
First of all, I'd like to congratulate the both of you. Sue, the book is just a wonderful testament to so many years of your work for peace and justice. So thank you. And Chris, not only your fault, but the reflection you gave was wonderful. You talk so much about Catholic social teaching, and I couldn't believe that it's needed more in our world than ever before. But so many Catholics do not know about the principles of Catholic social teaching. And in fact, some Catholics view them as political or not relevant or divisive in the whole discussions that we're dealing with. Do you have any reflection on ways in which each of us can help educate people about those principles, the ways in which our church, our institutions could do so? Because it is, I think they say, the best kept secret of the Catholic faith. And we need to bring it to light more now than ever, as you're doing with the book. So just any response to that. Thank you.
People heard the question okay?
I guess for me, that when I was writing the book, and I was also thinking about this case study that I shared with you, I think we're not accustomed to saying, oh, that's solidarity, recognizing the solidarity that's there, calling it that, or calling it the option for the poor, or, subsidiary is such a tough thing. Mm-hmm. But I don't know, it's having it in, that's the language of our tradition. But being able to identify it in practice where it's taking place, I think that's really important. Do you want to add anything?
I agree with you, Maureen. I think it's a real problem. And I'm not sure that I have the answer for that. I think that each of us who knows about it needs to help within that circle of influence to raise it up, whether it's a parish, whether it's in class, whether it's at one of the offices, no matter where we are. I think there's an opportunity there. Very often people are just not comfortable with talking about their faith because they think it's about proselytizing. So one of the other things that we learned is that to talk about values is an important way to move the conversation along. And so I think in our discussions, it's important that we bring up what the values are. That would be the first thing. Whether or not you then call it Catholic social teaching or whatever, that to me is less important than highlighting what the values are and including them as part of the conversation.
Barbara.
Yes, I'd just like to make two comments. One is, if you recall, the Catholic Church and the Conference of Bishops in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s, came out with a number of documents that they sent out to all the parishes throughout the country. And the parishes were supposed to bring people in the community together to discuss these documents and then take notes and send them back to Washington. And then a second draft would be sent out, the same process. That had a tremendous influence. It died when they came up with the Pastoral on Women. But I think that was an extremely extraordinary way. I was in Michigan at the time, and many of us were sent out to help parishes organize this. And the discussion of the people, this was Catholic social teaching being discussed, and then it died. But it's a great opportunity to revive something like that. The last thing I would say is this issue of justice in an unjust relationship. I think we have to be careful that we can build models of reconciliation when there's an agreement of equality between people. But when it is a relationship of inequality, rooted in the system of working relationships or whatever, we need to be careful and very conscious of the kinds of policies we establish in our institutions that ensure and secure that all are treated in a fashion that is reflective of our values. So it becomes a responsibility of each institution to ensure that a person who doesn't feel they can speak to power because of their status, I don't know how reconciliation is going to take place unless we change the dynamic and the structure for that person to feel they have a legitimate voice and a vehicle to express it whereby they won't be punished. I think I would not want to say that we can reconcile everything without some structural changes that would provide. Is that getting at your question?
Yeah. Thank you, Barbara. That's very helpful.
Right here.
Oh, okay. My question is about, I guess, Catholic social teaching and that tradition, while inspired by God, being ultimately written by men, right? Like the actual doctrines and things. So I'm just curious about when and where you found in your work, like the absence of like the female voice in a more concentrated sort of way, and how and where that falls short, and where you see in the future there being more of a, the voice of women represented more.
We okay with the question?
No, why don't you make it do it again?
So the question was, in looking at Catholic social teaching,
Right.
acknowledging it as originating from the divine, but
Right.
written by men, how have you dealt with the absence of the voices of women in this, and how might we look for more of that voice in this work?
The question would be, I don't know how to answer that, but the question would be, what would women bring to that? If women were writing Catholic social teaching, what would they write? What would the principles be? Would they be different? What's been left out?
I just wonder about them even being at the tables, like enough, and ultimately anything that's divinely inspired, right, doesn't have a gender or a gender association, right? Like I'm beyond that. I'm talking about just that idea that literally having women in the room, as these things are, when any important decision should be made, like it is being made, or any doctrine, I just feel like more and more women should be at the table than have been. And I just wondered where the absence of women in your reflection on CRS's history, where you see that as problematic, and maybe if you see a future where more and more women's voices, concerns, perspectives are being considered.
How about,
That would be good.
So, speaking from the experience within CRS, certainly when I joined, there were very few women in positions overseas. And I joined CRS as a Protestant. There were very few Protestants who worked overseas as well. And what I saw over time is that more women were hired, there was greater diversity. And so when we got to these planning processes, the decision had already been made that it was going to be a very inclusive approach. So by that point, there were lots of women. There were different nationalities. There were different faith traditions. And so that was in the initial planning thing. And so I never felt that there was an issue of not having women at the table. The other thing is that when the initial formation went out about what do we mean by justice, what do we mean by our values and our identity, because that included everybody, all of the genders and the religious traditions and the different experiences, you know, the differences between leaderships and program staff and administrative staff, it was all inclusive. So that was all rolled up. And frankly, I think that is why it ended up taking hold so much, because there was such an effort made to be inclusive. So if anything, for processes like this, whether you're looking at dialogue or synodality or any name that you want to put it, I think the deliberate decision up front to be as inclusive as possible is going to end up being something that simply makes more sense.
Now, I said that we were supposed to start on time and end on time, but we've already broken that. Are there other questions that would be worth putting out to the group that we could discuss, maybe a final question or two together? Or is this something that we can talk about when we have some snacks? I saw a couple of hands up. I've seen a nod there. Okay, then if you'll allow me, please, I'd just like to mention a couple of things. First, could we thank our panelists again? It's been mentioned once or twice before, but the books are available through the great support of our bookstore. Thank you very much. Please check that out. I also wanted to list the many sponsors for this event, but it's going to take too long to read them all because we have so many across campus. But just to read a few of them now, I'd like to thank the Falvey Library, the VU CRS Partnership, the Mother Cabrini Institute on Immigration, the Center for Humanitarian Engineering and International Development, and the Center for Church Management, among others. If I didn't mention your particular group, I apologize. And finally, this is the second to last event in our Solidarity series, the Oscar Romero Solidarity series. The final event is happening, I didn't write down the date.
April 8th.
April 8th, thank you. Where's Rose?
Yes.
April 8th, Medina Wilson Anton is a Delaware state rep. She's also a stand-up comedian, and she's giving Night to Remember. The title is Too Crazy to Quit. It's at 7:30 p.m. in Driscoll 132. Please check that out. Finally, can we please thank our panelists one more time, and please